Hello, and welcome to a Westferry Times deep dive. I'm Emily Carter, and today we're really digging into something that's shaking up British politics a bit. That's the rise of Reform UK. They've gone from being quite marginal to, well, consistently hitting double digits in some national polls, and that's making people wonder, what does this actually mean for the Conservatives,
Uh,
for Labour, for the whole political picture?
It really is, Emily. It's definitely a notable development in the political landscape.
Absolutely. And to help us unpack all of this, we've got Dr. Andrew Keller with us today. He's a respected political analyst and a senior fellow at the British Institute for Democracy. Andrew, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
And a big thank you to everyone watching Westferry Times for joining us. So, Andrew, maybe we can start right at the beginning. For anyone who isn't totally clear, what is Reform UK? How did it get started?
Sure. So Reform UK essentially evolved from the Brexit Party. You'll remember Nigel Farage set that up back in 2019. And its main goal, really its only goal then, was pushing for Brexit to actually happen. Once the UK had formally left the EU, the party looked for a new direction. So in 2021, they rebranded as Reform UK.
Yeah.
And that name change wasn't just cosmetic. It signaled they were broadening out, looking at issues like immigration, pushing for big economic changes, and a real focus on political accountability.
Right. So, moving beyond just Brexit, how well did that rebranding work initially? Did it catch on straight away?
Well, not immediately, no. It took a little while for this new version of the party to get the kind of sharp focus the Brexit party had. But as other things started dominating the headlines, the cost of living crisis is a big one. Farage's general message, that anti-establishment tone, started to find an audience again. Particularly, it seems, among conservative voters who maybe felt a bit let down or that the government wasn't tackling their main worries.
So that populist anti-establishment feeling found fertile ground again.
Exactly. That dissatisfaction with the main parties provided an opening, and Reform stepped into it.
Okay, so let's talk about these polls we're seeing now. Numbers around, 10, sometimes up to 14% nationally. How significant are figures like that? Is this just sort of background noise, or is it something more substantial?
I'd say it's definitely more than background noise now.
Mhm.
When you see that level of support sustained over time, it suggests Reform UK is tapping into something real, not just a temporary protest. And what's particularly telling is where that support is coming from. It seems quite concentrated among older, white, working-class voters.
Right.
And geographically, you see strengths, particularly in the Midlands and the North.
And that's difficult territory for the Conservatives, isn't it?
Precisely. It poses a direct threat to the Conservatives, especially in those marginal seats, the ones that can swing an election. Even losing a small slice of their vote share to Reform in those places could be enough to let another party win the seat.
So is this looking like a more permanent shift, do you think? Or could it just be a reaction to current events maybe fade away?
Well, politics is always unpredictable, isn't it? But the consistency suggests there might be deeper roots to this support. Even if Reform UK doesn't actually win many seats themselves, and our first past the post system makes that very hard for smaller parties.
Yeah, that's a huge barrier.
It is. But even without winning seats, if they maintain this polling level, they could absolutely cost the Conservatives dozens of seats at a general election. That's the real impact.
Let's drill down a bit more into who exactly is voting for reform. You mentioned older, white, working-class voters, often outside big cities. Can we flesh out that picture a bit more? What are their main concerns?
Yes, if you were to try and paint a picture, it's often, though not exclusively, men over 50, perhaps lower to middle income, living in towns or more rural areas rather than big metropolitan centers. There's often a feeling among these voters of being culturally maybe a bit left behind or economically overlooked by the mainstream parties.
And reform's policies speak to that directly.
Very much so. Their big messages, strong border control, a definite skepticism about net zero climate policies and the costs involved, cutting government waste, these seem to resonate very strongly with that specific demographic.
How much does this connect back to the Brexit vote itself? Is it basically the same coalition of voters motivated by similar things?
There's a huge amount of overlap, yes.
Mm.
You could argue Reform UK is capitalizing on a kind of post-Brexit disappointment. The sense among some Leave voters that, okay, we took back control, but has life actually improved? Have we seen the benefits we were promised? Reform is tapping right into that feeling of disillusionment.
Right. Now, you've talked about this posing an existential problem for the Conservative Party. That sounds quite dramatic. Why use such strong language?
Well, it really comes down to vote splitting on the right.
Yeah.
It's the nightmare scenario for the Conservatives. Think about it. In maybe over 100 constituencies, If Reform UK peels off even just, say, 5%, maybe up to 10% of the vote that would normally go conservative.
Then Labor or the Lib Dems could potentially sneak through.
Exactly. Doesn't take much in a tight race. And you can see the conservatives are worried. Rishi Sunak's rhetoric on immigration, on crime, it's become noticeably tougher. That's clearly an attempt to win back those voters tempted by reform.
But does that strategy actually work? Does trying to sound like reform stop people voting for reform?
It's a tricky one because, ironically, when the conservatives start echoing reform's talking points, it can almost make reform seem more credible, more mainstream. Some voters might think, well, if the Tories are saying this now, maybe reform had a point all along. Why not vote for the original?
So it's a real bind for them.
It is. If they ignore reform, they risk losing voters. If they try to copy them, they risk validating them and potentially still losing voters. It's a very difficult balancing act.
Okay, so the conservatives are clearly feeling the pressure. What about labor? How does reform's rise affect them and maybe the center-left more broadly?
Well, on the surface, labor potentially benefits, right? Anything that splits the right-wing vote makes their path to victory easier.
Makes sense.
But they can't be too complacent. Reform UK does have an economic message, sort of anti-globalist, pro-sovereignty, that could potentially appeal to some traditional labor voters too.
Especially in those red wall areas you mentioned.
Precisely. In areas that shifted away from Labour recently, voters who feel economically left behind might find some of Reform's nationalist or protectionist-sounding ideas attractive, particularly if Labour is perceived as being too focused elsewhere.
So, is there a real risk Labor could lose votes to reform?
I think a mass switch is unlikely. But could reform gain some traction in certain communities, especially if labor seems out of touch on, say, cultural issues or the cost of living? Yes, that's possible. It's something labor needs to be mindful of, even if the main dynamic is reform hurting the Tories.
Now, reform doesn't get the blanket media coverage that the big parties do. So how are they managing to cut through? How do they get their message out and build this momentum?
They've been very savvy with alternative channels. Social media is huge for them. Platforms like X, Facebook, YouTube videos. It lets them talk directly to potential supporters without relying on mainstream news outlets. And Nigel Farage himself is obviously a massive factor. His personal brand is still very powerful.
He still commands attention.
Absolutely. And their messaging is often designed for that online space, sharp, sometimes controversial, easily shareable. Plus, Farage has his platform on GB News, which gives him a regular voice.
And speaking of Farage, what if he did decide to formally return as leader? There's always speculation about that. What impact could that have?
Oh, that could be a game changer, potentially. If Farage came back to lead Reform UK formally, you'd likely see a noticeable bounce in their poll numbers, maybe even a significant one. He's a polarizing figure, no doubt, but he knows how to energize his base and dominate the news agenda like few others. He remains the big, unpredictable element in all this.
Okay, so final thoughts, Andrew. The big question. Looking ahead to a general election, whenever that might be, do you actually see Reform UK winning any seats in Parliament?
Under our current first-past-the-post system, it's still very, very difficult. I'd say it remains unlikely they'll win a significant number of seats, maybe even none at all.
So their impact isn't really about winning seats themselves.
Exactly. Their real power, as we've discussed, isn't likely to be in holding seats in Westminster. It's in shaping the debate, forcing other parties, mainly the Conservatives, to react to their agenda. And crucially, it's in their potential to deny the Conservatives votes in key places, which could ultimately determine who forms the next government. Their influence could be profound, even without winning a single constituency.
That's a fascinating point to end on. Their influence might be much bigger than their seat count suggests. Andrew, thank you so much for breaking all that down for us on this Westferry Times deep dive. Really insightful stuff.
It was my pleasure, Emily. Thanks for the discussion.
And thank you all for joining us. You've been listening to Westferry Times. Do like and share this video and subscribe to our channel, Westferry Times. Stay informed and stay curious. Goodbye for now.